Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be tier ranking all the Stephen King books that I've read so far. Are curious, I have read 19 Stephen King books so far. Yes, I am also upset that it's not an even 20, but you know, it is what it is. I will flash a quick image over the screen to show you all the books that I've read by Stephen King so far, but we don't need to hold our breath and take a minute because I'm going to be talking about them in great detail during this video. If you're new to my channel, you might not know this, but I actually used to dedicate entire reading vlogs dedicated to, you know, reading Stephen King books, like reading some of his classics that I was reading for the very first time. So I'll have all of those videos linked down below if you are curious to hear more of my in-depth thoughts and my experiences with reading these books for the first time. And also, if you are wondering, I do still have quite a bit of Stephen King books on my TBR. I'll flash another image over the screen of the 12 books that I do still have on my TBR that I would like to get to eventually. They're just not super high priority for me at this moment in time, but these are the 12 books that I hope to get to eventually. I guess you'll have to let me know if you would like to see any, you know, dedicated reading vlogs in the future for any of these 12 books, or if you think any of these 12 books are worthy of a dedicated vlog, because I'm not opposed to the idea of doing more Stephen King dedicated vlogs in the future, even though it's not something I've done in a while. So yeah, for my different tiers for this video, I thought it would be so fun to do something a little different, you know? I thought it would be interesting to mix it up. And so for the different tier titles, I decided to go with different quotes from Schitt's Creek, because even though I don't think there's a lot of crossover between Stephen King fans and Schitt's Creek fans, I mean, you can prove me wrong, like in the comments. If you love Stephen King and Schitt's Creek, let me know, because we're in the same club. But I just thought it would be like a fun way, you know, to tier rank these books. And honestly, I wish I could take credit for this idea, but it was not my original idea. I actually saw this post from Never Without My Book on Instagram. She made this different rating system using these different quotes from Schitt's Creek, and I was like, that is so cool, that is so creative, and I should do that for different tiers and rank books in that way. Right, so as you can see on my tiers here, I have the 5 tiers. Off to the left, we have Simply the Best, which is, you know, simply the best. It's like the, you know, the Tina Turner song. That just makes me so happy. That kind of defines the show in a way. So Simply the Best is gonna be the best of the best, you know? These are like the 5 stars, the God tiers. The second tier is gonna be I Love That Journey for me, because, you know, this is like the 4 stars, you know? This is like, I love that journey for me. I had a good time. It's not a new favorite, but I can see why it's super well loved and everything. The next one is going to be Best Wishes, Warmest Regards, which this one is just kind of like, you know, maybe it wasn't really for me, but like Best Wishes and Warmest Regards, like I have warm feelings towards it still because I can recognize that it's something good. It's just not necessarily for me, maybe. And then also maybe Best Wishes could be referring to like I went in with the best wishes, you know, because I thought it was going to be for me and maybe it didn't end up being that way, so it was only around a 3 star maybe. And then the second to last tier is I'm incapable of faking sincerity, and this is, you know, obviously going to be those books where I'm incapable of pretending that I like it when I don't, and it's just not that great. And then the last tier is going to be Ew, David, which, you know, if you're familiar with the show, it's like, ew, David, like the way that Alexis says it just cracks me up, oh my gosh. But anyways, these are gonna be the books that are like, ew, I don't understand why they're popular. I was not a fan. Also, I just wanted to warn you up, like right out the gate, straight up front, that even though I am a fan of some of Stephen King's books, I do have some unpopular opinions, and I'm not a fan of all of his books. And so if you're gonna try to comment something mean in the comments saying that I just don't understand or I just didn't read it right, honestly, just hold your breath, because we all have different opinions and it's fine. Some of us don't like every Stephen King book, and that's also fine. Anyways, jumping right into the first book on this list, I have 11/22/63, which is actually one of my favorite Stephen King books right off the bat. Like, we're starting with a good one. So I'm actually gonna put this one in Simply the Best, because this is a book that I went into not even sure if it was gonna be my thing or not, because, you know, I read Stephen King because I like the horror, you know, I want all of the horror stuff. But this one is actually one of his only like historical fiction, kind of like time travel, almost like sci-fi-ish kind of books. I went into this one thinking like, oh gosh, like I don't really know if this is gonna be my thing or not. And this book surprised the hell out of me. It made me bawl my fucking eyes out, okay? Like, I cried so fucking hard during this book. I actually do have the whole reading vlog where you can see me crying, so I'll have that link down below. But yeah, this is one of my favorite Stephen King books, and it really surprised me. If you do want to read this one, I would not let the page count intimidate you, you know, because this book is like 800 pages long or something crazy like that, and I was like, there's no way in hell I'm getting through this book. But I did, and it was worth it, and it's great. So yeah, wow. 11/22/63, what a banger. Okay, 1922 is the next book on this list. This one's actually a short story by Stephen King. It's a novella, and this one I'm actually gonna put I Love That Journey for me, because this is one that I still remember to this day right now. I remember how creeped out this book made me feel. This book I would not recommend if you're like afraid of rats, or maybe I would recommend it, you know, because if you're looking to get scared and you're afraid of rats, holy shit, there are some scenes in this book that are just truly disturbing. And I think that this book is really good because it's so short. You know, I feel like oftentimes Stephen King's books, like my biggest critique usually with his books is that he overwrites the hell out of everything. Like there is no reason why the book It or The Stand should be like over 1,000 pages, you know? But that's why I think books like 1922 are especially incredible, because he packs so much good story into those like 100 or so pages. And you don't need a story that's longer than that most of the time to have a really creepy and effective short story, you know? So I really like 1922. So yeah, the next one is going to be The Bazaar of Bad Dreams. And this one's hard to rate, you know, because if you didn't know, this one's actually a short story collection. So there's, you know, a whole bunch of different stories in this book. And so it's hard to rate overall, because I think there are some short stories in this collection that are absolutely fantastic, and then there are some that I thought were just fine, you know? So I feel like I'm gonna rate this one kind of like mid, you know, because I did go into this one with very high wishes, and this isn't one that I didn't enjoy, because, you know, I did really like it. There are some stories that stand out to me though more than others, but as far as like his, you know, short story collections go, I do have another one of his short story collections that I like more than this one. So I think that's why it has to be like a mid book for me. But yeah, it's still a really good time. I would still highly recommend checking out Bazaar of Bad Dreams. I think it's really interesting. Unlike this next book, however, which is Carrie, I know Carrie is like a classic among Stephen King fans, okay? I know that, we all know that Carrie was actually his first ever published book. Like, that's not to say it's the first book he ever wrote, but it was the first book that he ever got published. So, you know, it's kind of a big deal for Stephen King fans. It's been adapted into movies many times. However, I am not a fan of Carrie. I thought it was genuinely one of the most boring books that I've ever read in my whole life. And also, I was kind of like, about, you know, the fact that this like man, this old white man, Stephen King, is writing about this young pubescent teenage girl and like getting her period and doing all of that. It was just a little uncomfy for me at times, and just the way, like, there's a lot of heavy-handed religion stuff in this book that I also was just kind of like, okay, it just wasn't my favorite. You know, it's not a favorite of mine for Stephen King. I am torn between rating it on these bottom two tiers here. Like, I think I'm gonna put it on the second tier there, because there are other Stephen King books I think that I've enjoyed, even not as much as this one. So, like, for example, this next book, Dr. Sleep. Okay, I'm so sorry, but Dr. Sleep is going in Ew, David. I did not like Dr. Sleep, which is shocking to me because I'm a pretty big fan of The Shining, okay? So, like, that is why I am very shocked that I didn't like Dr. Sleep. Like, Dr. Sleep was just so incredibly boring. Like, I cannot believe how boring Dr. Sleep was. I thought all the characters were so boring. Like, following Danny Torrance as an adult, it should have been really interesting, but it wasn't. It was very boring, very slow. I actually do have an entire reading vlog dedicated to me reading Dr. Sleep, and it's not a fun time. You know, I'm just gonna say that up front. It's not a fun time, because this is probably one of my least favorite Stephen King's that I've ever read. I was just severely disappointed, and I think it's because, you know, the idea of following Danny Torrance in the future, like, I love the concept, and I think this book had so much fucking potential, and I think that's why it hurts my heart so much that I didn't enjoy this one, because it was probably one of my more anticipated books by him. So I feel like the more you anticipate something and then it lets you down, it like really lets you down, you know? And then the next book on this list is gonna be Elevation, and I'm not gonna lie, this is one that I've read so long ago, or at least it feels like I read it so long ago, and so I'm having trouble even remembering like the basics of this book, but from what I do remember about it, I didn't really enjoy it, so I think I'm gonna put it on that second tier there. So this book was upsetting because, you know, it's kind of more a short story, or it's like on the shorter side. I think it's a novella, but this story was so incredibly boring. We're following this man who is rapidly losing weight but not getting any smaller for no apparent reason. He also has the ability to render things weightless, and I don't know, I thought the concept of this book was pretty intriguing, you know? I was like, okay, like, what's going on? But honestly, it's so annoying to me that this book is categorized as horror on Goodreads, and it actually ended up winning the the horror category on Goodreads for the year that it was, published. And it's shocking to me because this book is not horror. And this book, I just didn't have any fun with it. I feel like these characters were all very one-dimensional, very stereotypical kind of characters. The ending to me felt very cheesy and underwhelming. For such a short book, it took me a long time to get through this one because I was just so bored and I was like, what is going on? All right, the next book on this list is It, the beloved It, the classic. This one is hard for me to rate because, if you didn't know, It, as I mentioned earlier, it's over 1,000 pages. It's about 1,100 pages. And so this book was quite the journey to read. I'm kind of bummed that I did read this one before I was doing reading vlogs. I read this one back in 2017, but I remember making it a goal for myself to read this book in 6 days. So I was doing about 200 pages every day and I was reading it just with my eyes, which whoa, that is just wild. But I feel like as much as I enjoyed the story It, it's definitely one of those things where I prefer the movie over the books, especially the movie, the 2017, newer movie that just came out recently with the kids. I definitely have a fondness, soft spot in my soul for the movie, and I think the movie is a lot more enjoyable, at least for me personally. This book, at the end of the day, ended up being around a 3-star for me. It was not a new favorite, but I'm also glad that I read it because I would have felt like I was missing out on something in a way if I didn't read it. So with all that being said, I think I'm gonna put It in I Love That Journey for me, just because reading this was such a memorable time for me. I read it in August of 2017. I just remember so much of my reading experience with this book. And even though there were definitely parts of this book that I was not a fan of, like that very problematic ending, if you know, you fucking know. But at the same time, I don't know, I just have a special place in my heart for this book. I really love the idea of it. I love the concept. I love Pennywise. I love the idea of this It creature. The concepts in It are very strong. And so I think even though the execution of the book wasn't necessarily my favorite, I still think the story overall is one that really stands out to me when it comes to Stephen King's books. The next book on this list is actually going to be Later, which is one of his more recently published books. This one is actually also not necessarily horror, I would say. It's kind of horror, but it also feels more like a crime thriller to me. And this one, I'm actually also going to put that in I Love That Journey for me, because while this one isn't necessarily a new favorite of mine when it comes to Stephen King books, I really enjoyed this one. Really like that in the book Later, we're just following this young boy who is discovering that he might have some kind of supernatural abilities, and then it's about how he's, just living with his single mother, and he's starting to feel like maybe he could do more with his supernatural abilities, and he even starts to help the police force, the local police force with cases and stuff. It's just really interesting. I like that this book, in a way, it almost kind of feels like his older work, with Stephen King, because I love, whenever Stephen King writes about kids with, supernatural abilities. That's, one of my favorite, Stephen King tropes to read about. So this book definitely reminded me of that, but I also liked that it was very, crime thriller at the same time. It was very interesting. It had a good mystery. I just wasn't really a fan of, the ending of this book or, where the story ended up going. So that's why it's not a new, favorite of mine. But yeah, it was a good time. I love that journey for me. And then Misery by Stephen King. This is one that I want to rank it kind of mid, which I know might be kind of shocking because Misery is such a well-loved book, and I wanted to love it so freaking badly, but I think this is another scenario for me where I thought the book was fine, but the movie is god tier, and I think the movie works so much better for me in so many ways. I just think the book Misery, it was a little bit repetitive for me, it just wasn't my favorite. I didn't like that we got this story within a story in this book, because this story is all about this woman, Annie, who basically kidnaps this author. This author gets into a car accident near her home, and then she takes him for recovery in her own home, and then she basically forces him to write the next book in her favorite series. The concept is just so great, right? Such a good concept, so interesting. But I think the part that annoyed me about the book is that we got to see his book that he was writing within the book. So it was kind of slower at times, because I think a book within a book is only interesting sometimes, and in this case it just didn't really work for me. But also Annie is such a great character that she really made this reading experience worth it, and she made this reading experience so much fun. However, I think the book overall, it's just a mid one for me. It's not my favorite, but I had a decent time reading it though, Unlike the next one, which is Mr. Mercedes, unfortunately, this one's gonna go in ew, David. I know you're probably like, wait, hold up, because Mr. Mercedes is such a popular, you know, Stephen King book series, but Mr. Mercedes just did not work for me. I was not a fan of this book at all, and in fact, it was a DNF for me. Didn't finish it, only got about maybe 100 to 150 pages into this book. I think, you know, like the biggest issue that I definitely have with Mr. Mercedes is the way that Stephen King chooses to write women in this book. I just think it's so gross and so like, annoying. Like, I honestly couldn't even deal with it. And I know that you can say a lot of the same for most of Stephen King's books, especially the ones that were published, you know, more back in the day. But that's what I think is even more upsetting about Mr. Mercedes, is the fact that it was published pretty recently. And I just don't like, you know, like we're following our main protagonist in this book is like an old man detective dude. And just the way that he goes about describing women and like their tiny waists and their big boobs, it's just so gross, so annoying. I'm tired. We also get the point of view of like the killer, like the guy that we're not supposed to like. And it's just so gross. Like the way he's talking about his mom's panties and like he wants to like see what's under there with his mom. I'm like, ew. Like, I just can't, okay? I can't. I'm sorry. I know that he's supposed to be unlikable, probably, but also our main protagonist is supposed to be likable, and the way that he's talking about women also just rubs me the wrong way entirely, and it's just gross. I don't like it. So Mr. Mercedes is ew David, like the most ew David on this whole list. The next book we have on this list is Night Shift, which this is probably my personal favorite Stephen King collection of short stories that I've read. I've only read the 2 so far, but Night Shift has some of my favorite short stories of all of his yet, so I think I'm going to put this one in I Love That Journey for me, because it's not simply the best, because there are a few short stories in this collection that don't really work for me, but at the same time there are so many, like even that I can name off the top of my head, like The Boogeyman, one of my favorite short stories he's ever written. Also Quitters Inc. I think about that short story like almost every single day because it reminds me so much of like a Black Mirror episode. It's just so fascinating. I also think it's so cool that this was his first ever published short story collection, and it's from the 70s if I'm not incorrect, and I just love it so much. Like I think it's genuinely some of his best work, and I think that this just proves the fact that Stephen King is capable of writing really good short stories that don't need to be very long to be creepy. You know what I'm saying? Like this was incredible. I loved it so much. I think it's one of his best. I would highly recommend checking it out if you're a fan of short story collections. I do think this is one of his better books. And then the next collection, I don't know if this counts because this is the On Writing book, right? So this is his nonfiction story about his writing experience. But regardless of whether or not you think this should be on the list or not, I'm going to put this in Simply the Best. I really loved, reading about his experience as an author, reading a little bit more about his life and like learning how he writes and like learning more about his writing career and his writing style. As someone who is also an aspiring writer, like that is something that I would love to do one day. I just loved hearing more about his experiences with it, kind of like what he's been through in his life. I'm a huge fan of reading nonfiction books for people that I'm really interested in reading about, so I just really enjoyed this one. The hype is real. If you've only heard good things about On Writing, it's because it's worth it, and I just love the advice that he has to give in this book. I think it's all really smart, and it's still something that I think about to this day, and this is honestly one that I would actually want to reread again because I just got so much from it, and it was really inspiring and like motivating, and I don't know, I fucking loved it. So it's simply the best, okay? And then also Pet Sematary is the next book on this list. And if you know anything about my taste, I mean, I've got a Pet Sematary shirt on right now, so it's not a huge stretch to think that this is my favorite Stephen King book, because it is. This is simply the best, and it's going at the very top of my chart here, simply the best, because Pet Sematary is my #1 favorite Stephen King book. To this day, I don't think that's ever gonna change. And also, this is the Stephen King book that really got me, into Stephen King in the first place. I mean, before reading Pet Sematary, I had read a few of his books, even a few of the books on this list. But Pet Sematary is the book that really got me, like, hooked. Pet Sematary is the book that I decided I was gonna start doing, like, monthly Stephen King reading vlogs after that because it just really got me. And Pet Sematary is a unique story of his, because I think it's one of those books where it's a horror book, but the most horrifying elements of this book are the fact that it feels so real. It feels very, like, real-life horror to me, and I think that's something that I really love about this one. I also just think the concept is absolutely fascinating, you know, like if you don't know the general premise of Pet Sematary, it's basically that this family moves into this new house that's on this crazy busy street. The dad is a doctor, and in the back of the house, like there's this pet cemetery where all the people in the town have buried their pets, but the pet cemetery is kind of like a magical, creepy little place, because if you bury your pet there, the pet comes back to life. And that is just the general, you know, vague premise of the book, but I think this book is so well written. I just think it's such a beautiful and intense story, you know, like this book just made me feel so much, and it made me absolutely horrified to imagine the situation that this family gets put into. It's just so fucking good, so worth the hype. The next book on this list is going to be Salem's Lot, which this is another one that I do consider to be one of my more faves. This one is basically, it just follows in this town, you know, called Salem's Lot. It's one of his more popular books. I'm pretty sure this was his second published book ever after Carrie. So it's definitely one of Stephen King's more like well-known, you know, books. This one, it involves, you know, a small town called Salem's Lot. It involves vampires. It involves this creepy ass haunted house. And this one just has some of the best vibes, I think, out of any Stephen King book that I've read so far. And that's why I think I would have to put this one in I Love That Journey for me, because even though I think personally I gave this one like 3 to 3.5 stars, it wasn't like one of my favorite reading experiences with Stephen King, but I also do love that journey for me because Salem's Lot is such a classic and I had so much fun reading this book. This book is also one of the like rare Stephen King books that actually kind of scared me a little bit, because I was reading this book like late into the night, and if you know about the scenes with like the open windows, then you fucking know that I was terrified reading some of this book like late at night, and so it actually kind of got to me in a way that genuinely creeped me out, which so rarely happens, I feel like. The next book on this list is The Body, which is the most recent read of any Stephen King book that I've had on this list. I actually just read The Body for the last video that I just did, and sadly I wasn't a huge fan of The Body, which is, I guess, shocking to a lot of Stephen King fans, because this is the story that's based on the movie adaptation for Stand By Me, which is, I guess, one of his biggest movie adaptations. I personally have not seen Stand By Me, so maybe that's part of the issue of why I didn't connect with this book personally very much. But sadly, I'm gonna put this one in the second to last tier because I am incapable of faking sincerity with this one. This one just follows this like group of boys in like the 1950s, 1960s times. They are basically discovering a body out like in the woods, in the wilderness, in their town. That's like the general premise of the story. It's actually kind of like a shorter story. It's a novella, so it's not too long. But for some reason, this one took me so long to get through because I was so freaking bored. I also just wasn't a huge fan of the way that this book was written, because we do get, you know, like the flashback chapters of when they were younger and they were kids and they were discovering this body, but then we also do get the present day chapters which take place in like the 80s, and then it's about this guy who is the protagonist in the book. He's like a writer in the present day and he's writing the story of what happened when they were kids. I don't know, it was just very boring. I just didn't like this one. I don't really get the hype with it, if I'm being honest, sorry. And then the next one on this list is The Institute, which this is one of his more recently published ones that I've read. I really enjoyed The Institute. I thought The Institute was so much fun. I'm gonna put it in I Love That Journey for me, because I think, you know, it's not a new favorite of mine, but I think the concept is really strong. It was a really fun, engaging read, and this book is kind of about this, you know, this place called the Institute where they do all these tests and they test on all these kids that have these supernatural abilities. It does give me very Stranger Things vibes, you know, because in the last video that I did, I ended up reading The Body because it was recommended for fans of Stranger Things, but then I would get so many comments of people being like, no, The Institute and It have a lot more Stranger Things vibes, and I would definitely agree. I mean, I've read both It and The Institute, and I do think that The Institute has major Stranger Things vibes, just because we're talking, you know, kids with supernatural abilities getting tested in a lab. It's very much that vibe. Unlike The Long Walk is the next book on this list, and sadly I wanted to love The Long Walk so badly, you know, I wanted to get it, I wanted to be in with it, but sadly I didn't like The Long Walk, and I'm gonna put it in I'm incapable of faking sincerity, which kind of hurts, you know, a little bit, because I know that this is a very loved book by the Stephen King fans, you know, like I know that. But this book just didn't really work for me. I think as a concept, it's really interesting and really cool, but actually reading this book was like watching fucking paint dry. It was just so boring for me. We follow these 100 boys who choose to compete in this competition called The Long Walk, and they basically just have to walk to their deaths until there's only one of them left standing, and then that person wins a lot of money and they get to live, whereas everybody else gets to die. And I know that this book has a lot of commentary on like the war and things like that, and I do appreciate the commentary that this book has. And again, like I said, I like the concept. I think it's a really interesting concept, but the actual like act of reading this book just absolutely drained me. It was so boring. It was just reading about these boys walking. Like literally the entire book is just them walking in this competition. I just expected there to be a little bit more action or maybe more, you know, like something else going on, but it was just kind of boring for me. Like, and I felt like this book didn't give what I was hoping it would give. The next book on this list is The Shining, which, you know, like I said, huge fan of The Shining over here, huge fan. However, I will say that I am a bigger fan of the Shining movie adaptation than I am of the book. I don't know if that's like a super unpopular opinion because, you know, Stephen King himself does not like the movie adaptation and he obviously much prefers the book, but I feel like for most Stephen King fans, there's a lot of Stephen King fans that I know that also prefer the movie over the book, so you'll have to let me know in the comments which one you prefer. But for me personally, I do prefer the Shining movie because Jack Nicholson is like one of my favorite performances of all time as Jack Torrance. I just think it's so fucking good. And so for those reasons, I'm gonna put the Shining book in I Love That Journey for me because it's not simply the best, because the best is the Shining movie, okay? Like, the Shining movie is God tier. But I think the story just really works for me, you know, because it's really scary, you know, the idea of this dad, Jack Torrance, he's taking his family up to the Overlook Hotel for like the winter time, you know, they're gonna be isolated up there during a snowstorm, and you know, he's working on his next book, right? Like, he's trying to write his next book in the isolation, but the family before that had been watching this hotel, the dad like went crazy and killed both of his twin daughters and killed his wife and just like lost his mind. It's just so scary, like absolutely horrifying, terrifying, so good. The Shining, like what a classic, amazing. And then the last book on this list is The Stand, which is tied, I think, for the longest Stephen King book that I've ever read, and the longest book that I've ever read, period, because The Stand is another book that's about 1,100 pages long. But The Stand, sadly, is gonna go in like, it's like a mid for me, you know, like best wishes, warmest regards. I think The Stand had a really cool concept. I think I went into it with some really high expectations, because if you didn't know, this is Stephen King's like pandemic book, you know, like this is a book where we're following in a world where there's like a deadly ass flu virus that is just killing bitches left and right. And yes, I did read this during the pandemic, and it definitely added to the experience, you know, because it felt very realistic at times, and it was very scary to be reading this during a real pandemic. But at the same time, this book was just so boring in some parts for me, and there were some characters that I liked in this book, but then there were others that I didn't really care for in this book, and so it made the reading experience kind of like, for me. However, I did have a ship in this book. Like, I shipped these two characters together so hard in this book, so that definitely made the journey worthwhile, because at least I had that going for me. Like, I was like, oh my god, like my heart, like I ship it. And that's like so rare for me in Stephen King books, that I have like a romantic ship. But at the same time, I just really don't think The Stand is like worth all the hype that it gets. Like, it's definitely not my favorite pandemic book that I've ever read, and I actually think this book would have been a lot better for me if the pandemic had been more involved in the story, because I feel like, you know, The Stand, it's like 1,100 pages, and I feel like the pandemic is only really part of the story for like barely the beginning, like maybe 100 pages, maybe 200 at the most, but then after that, the pandemic isn't really brought up anymore. It just turns into the kind of this like apocalyptic survival kind of story in a way, which is fine, but like I guess I just expected the pandemic to be more involved. Yeah, I don't know, it's not my favorite, you know, and it's not necessarily one that I regret reading, but it's also not one that I would go around recommending to everybody to read. Alright, so that concludes the tier ranking of the Stephen King books. Let me know, what did you think? Like, what do you think of these books if you've read any of these books? If you are a fan of Stephen King, you know, please let me know, how many of his books have you read? Because I know he has so many freaking books, like I don't think I could ever get get through his entire backlist because he has so many freaking books. Once again, I will flash on the screen the 12 books that I am most interested in reading from Stephen King. So if you've read any of these 12 books, I would love your opinions on, you know, which ones you think that I would like based on, you know, my taste in Stephen King books, or which ones you think I should avoid and you think I wouldn't like based on the previous books that I have not enjoyed. I would love any feedback, and also love to know if you would like to see any reading vlogs dedicated to any of these books. Like I said, if you disagree with my opinions, that is totally fine. We can have different opinions. I'm not mad about it, so you shouldn't be mad about it either. And please just choose kindness in the comments, you know, be kind to each other. If people have different opinions on Stephen King books, that's totally fine. Life would be boring if we were all the same, right? And thank you all so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye.